In a world of 4K, 8K, 12K, iPhone AI enhancement, HDR, photography and video has really never been more perfect or sterilized. The more we strive towards that perfect image, the more some people have fought to go backwards to a nostalgic time. Tarantino, Nolan shooting on film exclusively, or it could just be people like me using a Black Pro Mist like right now, or getting out the old Olympus film camera and taking a couple shots with that every once in a while. Here it is, by the way. Look at that beauty. Amazing. The craftsmanship, and that's part of the whole point. A technically good image is nice or even important for certain things. We don't fall in love with things because of how perfect it is. Those quirks and flaws in certain things sometimes really end up becoming some of our favorite things. And that is where the subject of today's video comes in. Dehancer is a film emulation program. It really does simulate the process of developing film from start to finish, and has a lot of extra features besides just the color and the grain. It also is getting into bloom and halation and lets you do some other cool things too. So yeah, we're gonna get into all of it. So you guys know I shoot on the S5 or the GH6 here, and these are some amazing cameras, super high resolution, but the footage out of here is super sharp. See, this sensor, I mean, you're not gonna be able to see it, but I still am showing. This sensor has no OLPF, which makes the footage out of this thing very, cut myself there a little bit. This footage is just so freaking sharp. You gotta be careful. Okay, that's a terrible joke, but seriously, the 5.7, 5.8K footage out of this, the 6K footage out of the S5 II and S5 IIX, no optical low pass filter makes this footage insanely sharp. And that's great for some things, details, weddings maybe, especially corporate stuff that needs that sharp, crispy, contrasty stuff. But for things like films and music videos and, you know, anything creative, going for a certain feeling, a certain look, sharpness ain't everything. In fact, sometimes it's just a little too sharp. So without further ado, let's check out a quick little piece of test footage I shot with Dehancer and the GH6, and then we'll get into how I use it, what I think of how it's laid out, and everything else.
Sweetheart, do you wanna be mon mari? Oui, 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 ma whole vie. How hard can it be? And I'll be your mannequin, your top 10, and you'll write me a poem. Until then, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, let's rob a bank. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Next question in the script. Comme ci, comme ça, ouais, ouais, ouais. J'adore mes amis. Oh, how dull life would be. And I'd be a vagabond. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, let's rob a bank. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Next question in the screen. Ba, 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 da, da. Let's rob a bank. Wah, wah, wah. Ba, 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 da, da. Ba, ba, da, da. Next question in the screen. Ba, 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 da, da. Ba, ba, da, da. Next question in the screen. Ba, 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 da, da. Ba, ba, da, da. Next question in the screen.
So yeah, I really love this test footage, the colors that it was transformed into, and the grain is perfect. I didn't go too overboard for this particular piece, but yeah, I think it looks really, really good. So Dehancer, it's definitely a super powerful program, a super powerful plugin. It's even great for your iOS devices. It can be used in photos as well. Like, it's just super, super cool. I really have enjoyed my time with this. And as someone who loves film grain and halation and bloom and dirtying up the image with lower quality, technically, lenses and all that stuff, it's just, it was the perfect plugin for me. And if you do a lot of music videos, Instagram stuff, anything along those lines, I really can't recommend this enough. So I always like to see how easy it is to use a program right out of the box without watching tutorials or videos or reading a manual or anything. And that's pretty much what I did with that test footage. And I'll go through kind of my process for just kind of winging it right now. We'll talk about some of the details on what these things actually do more in depth later on. Of course, the first step, like usual for any project, is the normal importing and editing. And then, you know, I like to work in Premiere, so I use an adjustment layer which will contain our overall grade, which in this case, of course, is going to be powered by Dehancer. I already did this grade once, but I'm going to kind of start over from scratch and go over kind of the techniques I used to kind of just wing it, which is, I think, how a lot of people are going to use this, but it's nice that this can grow with you and you can learn more about this as time goes on instead of just being stuck with simple controls. You can use simple controls in a few of the things I'm going to show you, or you can go more in depth with bigger projects that require more precision. So there's obviously a ton of options, but generally I think it's good to start at the top and work your way down. So of course the top thing is your source footage, which is going to interpret whatever camera you ended up using. So of course there's stuff like Rec 709, Rec 2020, which I think is going to be, I think 2020 is like a smartphone HDR color space, but the most interesting part for a lot of people is going to be going to the Choose camera, where there are a ton of cameras and profiles that exist already to really specifically tailor this footage for your setup. Now, in terms of Panasonic, there's only the GH5 and GH5S, so no luck for my GH6 footage, but I'm going to show you how to get around that really quickly. So if your camera is not in there and you shot in a kind of standard normal color space, the Rec 709 at the top should work just fine. With log footage, you're gonna have to do a little bit more work. So I drag in a Lumetri color effect, and I just do a simple color transform. So I went from Vlog to the nicest 709 profile, and sometimes I'll use the fashion low contrast profile to get us into a Rec 709 color space. By the way, all these Varicam LUTs are for free on this site in the description below, so check that out if you want some good LUTs to drop on your footage and to get it into a Rec 709 color space. Make sure Lumetri Color is above Dehancer in the effects tab, and after that you can head back over to Dehancer itself. The other main thing I check in the input tab is the defringe tool, which can reduce some chromatic aberration in your shots, which will help other effects we're going to apply later. I'm going to skip over a few of these middle things for now, but the biggest choice you're probably going to have to make in this whole process is selecting your film stock. Now, they have an absolute ton of film stocks, which can make choosing it kind of difficult. So in this case, I just went with the Kodak Portra 800. It's one of the more neutral, slightly warm film stocks, and it's made for shooting people and human subjects. It's also a stock I've used in real life, so I decided it would be a great one to use for this project. So after that's looking good, next step up is also important, which is the film grain. So I'm sure you guys all know, but film grain is kind of just like the good version of digital noise. So you can really do a lot of creative stuff here. You can choose the size, the strength, and a thing I love to do is play around with how the film is distributed among the shadows, midtones, and highlights. With digital video, the noise is always going to be majority in the dark parts and shadows of the image, but with film, it could be all over the place based on the stock, and so pushing a little bit of grain into the highlights is a really cool effect that can really get that retro film aesthetic across. So that's what I did. And I can't really put my finger on it, but for whatever reason, this grain seems to survive online compression a little bit better than other methods I've used in the past. So now it's time for two things that I think really sets this plugin a step above others, which is the bloom and halation settings. I finally looked up the difference between bloom and halation, by the way. So halation is kind of like a direct impact on the film where it bleeds into the bright and dark parts, and bloom happens more on a lens side. So technically with like something like the Black Promise like we've got here, so technically something like this around the lens would be bloom, but the more reddish, smaller glow, which we're going to talk about a little bit more, is halation. You learned something today, even if the rest of the video you don't care about. So with these two settings, it's all about setting up the limiters and the smoothness to really help where that cutoff point is in terms of what is really going to glow and what isn't. And the smoothness helps make it look more natural and not as artificial. After that, changing the amplify to make the effect stronger or more subtle is usually enough to get a really good looking image, but of course there's a ton of other settings with diffusion, hue shifts, and things like that to really dial in a look based on your particular shot. Film emulation, just like film itself, is more of an art than a science, and you know, I think that kind of fits, so just kind of play around with whatever works best for your project. Moving on to bloom, this really helps smooth out the halation effects even more and make them super natural, and a lot of the controls here are very similar or even identical and do pretty similar things. So once again, I just messed around with these until they looked good and nice and bloomy. This is basically the Black Promise portion of the effect, so it really helps glow those highlights out. The reason people like high dynamic range cameras is because really harsh clipping highlights make videos look really cheap. But with programs like this, I actually love when my highlights bloom in some situations because that nice glow just feels really natural and true to what, you know, your eye would see in real life or what film would do in older movies. There's definitely a few more things towards the bottom here, film breathing and, you know, all these sort of things, vignetting, but I was so happy with the images at this point that I kind of just called it a day and wanted to just kind of turn this around and see how I could do. And these last couple details are really just going to be the cherry on top to bring this effect home. I also love how you can pick and choose and really easily enable or disable certain aspects and certain features, you know, so if you want to turn off the grain, just turn off the grain and use the bloom and halation. Maybe you're editing one version for YouTube, which has a little bit better compression, or Vimeo, but then you're sending like a low resolution version to Instagram where the grain might kind of smudge things up a little bit, which hasn't been my experience, but if you're worried about that, turn the grain off, export a different version, you're good to go. So I appreciate that Dehancer didn't ask me to do anything in particular with this video. They said, say what you want, do what you want, all this sort of stuff. And I really wanted to give it an honest evaluation and first impressions. But the one thing they asked me politely if I could do was take a look at the phone app. And honestly, I think the app you can get on your phone is really powerful for a phone app. But I also think it might be the quickest way to give this a try and see if it's for you, because it pretty much has all the features that we're going to talk about later right in the phone. My goal here was to try and replicate digitally a shot that I shot on real Portra 800 film, and I got pretty close, but I definitely could have spent a little bit more time on it if I wanted it to be perfect. My relationship with film is interesting. Some of my favorite shows and movies were shot on film, especially 16mm that can get that really gritty film. I love Black Swan and The Wrestler. I always loved the cinematography of The Walking Dead, which until like the last season was shot on 16mm film. Some of my other favorites like The Wire and Breaking Bad are super grainy, handheld, look amazing. And my favorite show of all time, The Shield, is the epitome of like grungy, hardcore awesomeness. And I definitely look to those shows for inspiration for my cinematography style. I won't be able to afford film for the vast majority of projects. I had a 16mm camera I tried to fix up. Hopefully I can find some footage of that, and I never could quite get it running. Like I said, I'm shooting on 35mm film for stills, but when it comes to video, this is the best case scenario for most people at most levels, in my opinion. Yeah, the fact that this is a one-stop shop, you've got your grain, your color, your camera picture profiles, a lot of other very nuanced push and pull, contrast changing things, as well as that halation and bloom, along with your chromatic aberration reduction, which can help take away some chromatic aberration. And I know I've been saying that I was going to explain all these different settings, but honestly, my buddy over at Red Frame Tech does a much better job than me, so I just head over and watch his video. It's really, really good, actually. There's definitely a few downsides, though, I want to talk about. So these all have a pretty easy workaround, which I'm going to talk about as well, but still, I thought it was worth mentioning. So this program has quite a few cameras in it, but like I talked about before, not a ton, and some of the newer cameras are definitely falling behind. So if you can get a very standard Rec 709 transform beforehand and then just use the standard, I think the results are going to be pretty good. But if your camera's in there, I would definitely go with that. I use a lot of log footage, so that's important to me. Finding a vlog to standard is not super hard. I just use nicest or maybe fashion low contrast, and you're good to go from the free VariCams LUT pack. The other thing is this is a fairly processor intensive plugin, so you can't really edit your video like in real time from day one with this turned on. So generally I'll kind of layer it over the top, add in the effects and get it to where I want it to look like, and then turn it off, and then just turn it on every once in a while. You're likely not going to edit like a whole video with this layer turned on all the time. One last negative I found was I love the tight grain controls. That's super cool, but I wish there was almost like presets in there. So like I've downloaded overlays and other things before that have like 35 or 16 or 8mm, and they kind of dynamically adjust and everything, which is pretty cool. But this is kind of just like, it's up to you to decide what 16mm looks like or what 8mm looks like with all the controls, which is great. Those options are there. I just wish maybe there was like presets for, you know, maybe even like larger film stocks like 65, 70mm prints and things like that. I think the bloom and halation looks really, really solid most of the time. I've had a few situations where the halation felt a little off, but that was few and far between. And the way it just smooths out those highlights, smooths out the skin and the colors. I mean, the green and red in those test clips were really vibrant and really, I don't know, I really just love what the program did with those and how it handled it with the vlog footage. Shout out again to Dehancer as well for reaching out. I don't get reached out to by a lot of people, but when I do, I always appreciate it, especially if it's something that I really enjoy, and that's really the only type of stuff I like to take a look at. And thankfully they impressed me and I was able to bring this video to you guys. I think this is super awesome and it's right up my alley. I think the only thing it might be missing to like correct your footage and get it into a perfect working place is the lack of camera profiles. So you might need to find some kind of transform to get it into the 7:9 space, but that's not a big deal. And then if you have kind of noisy footage, it might conflict a little bit and there's no built-in noise reduction, which if it did, that would be maybe a little too much to put into one package. Besides those two little things, and those aren't even really big deals at all, I really do think it's like a complete emulation package. So if you're doing period pieces, or you just want to have like a look that's like Atlanta, or shows that were actually shot on film that we talked about before, I think this is one of the better programs out there. Now, I don't want to end this video without talking about price, and yes, I've got my discount code RTFilm, but still with discounts, it's not a super cheap program. I've seen some that are like $300 a year. I've seen some that are $1,000. I've seen some that are definitely cheaper, like some of these overlays that are kind of just for the grain and things like that. So could you piecemeal this together with a couple other programs and overlays and things like that? Yes. But I think the quality won't be as good, and I don't think the experience will be as seamless, and you might have things conflicting with each other, you know, like, do you put the halation effect on before or after the grain? Do you put the bloom on before or after the grain? How do these things interact? Like, if you source these from other places. So let me know what you guys think. If you guys are interested, definitely check out my discount code to get a little bit off the top. ease that load just a little bit and let me know what you think of film emulation as a whole. Do you use it? What do you use? Are you interested in Dehancer? I'm very interested to hear from you as always and start this discussion out. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. I appreciate you guys stopping by. Have an amazing day, and I will see you guys in the next video.